Okay, we're into the next section of the excretory system. So we've learned all the basics, mainly about the structure, and in this advanced section we'll learn a bit more about the function of how urine actually gets made in the excretory system. So the learning intention is the same. The excretory system removes wastes from the bloodstream. And after today, you should be able to describe the tissue layers that make up the organs in the excretory system and be able to analyze each of the 4 stages of urine formation, which are filtration, reabsorption, secretion, and excretion. Let's firstly look at the main tissue types that make up the organs in the excretory system. So this applies to all of the hollow organs in the excretory system, the ones that have urine passing through them. So the ureters, the bladder, and the urethra. So all of these organs have 3 main layers in them. The first layer on the inside is made of epithelial tissue, really similar to the digestive system. So it's a few cell layers thick, and the whole point of this layer, the function, is to be a waterproof barrier and stop any urine leaking out of the organ into the body. Of course, it has to be watertight so we don't have any waste products getting out. The second layer further out in the tube is made of muscle, and it's smooth muscle in particular. So just like the digestive system, smooth muscle we can't control. It's a subconscious muscle, and it slowly contracts, particularly in the ureters, to slowly push urine from the ureters down into the bladder. So a really similar process to peristalsis in the digestive system. The third layer is the outside layer of all these organs, and it's made of connective tissue and nervous tissue. So the connective tissue is there basically to hold all the organs together. It can expand and contract, like the bladder can expand many times, depending how much urine's in there. And there are lots of nerves in this layer of tissue as well, which controls the muscles and also helps us to sense. So when we know we're busting for the toilet, that's because the nerves in the nervous tissue can sense how stretched our bladder is. Alright, so the next section is we're jumping into some details of how urine actually gets made and how the nephrons filter the blood in the kidneys. So this is a review of the 4 stages we looked at briefly, and we're going to look into each one of these in more detail. So we start with filtration, then we have reabsorption, then we have secretion, and then last of all we have excretion of the final urine. Alright, so step 1. This is the filtering part in filtration. So remember, we're at the top of the nephron where we've got what's called the glomerulus. And the glomerulus is this tightly packed ball of capillaries here. And just like every small blood vessel, it's surrounded by epithelial tissue. And it's really just one layer of cells thick. So that means this little layer around the capillaries is semi-permeable, and it's going to act like a filter, just like you can see here. We can imagine the holes in the filter here are like the gaps between the cells in the blood vessels. So when the blood enters from the renal artery, it goes into the kidney, and then it goes into the top here of the nephron. So because blood is always under pressure, then when the blood gets to the glomerulus, there's lots and lots of water pressure on that blood, and that pushes lots of the water and the smaller solutes out of the blood through those gaps in the capillary wall. And it's only the small molecules that can fit through the gaps. That's why it's semi-permeable. So the small molecules that can get out, obviously, is water, plus some ions, some salts, sugars from our sugar digestion, and amino acids from our protein digestion. And all of that material, remember, gets filtered out into this little capsule, this little space surrounding the capillaries called the Bowman's capsule. And that collects all of this material, and it's called the filtrate at this stage. Filtrate is anything that gets removed from a filter. Sorry, is anything that passes through a filter. But that means there's larger materials that don't pass through the filter, and they're going to stay in the bloodstream in the capillaries. So it's large materials like the red blood cells and the white blood cells and proteins as well that are still in the blood. So that's like these larger particles here that are getting trapped and can't get through the filter. All right, so we've done our filtering up here in the glomerulus. Then the filtrate starts to pass down through the tubule. But the problem is the filtrate is just filtering out everything small. And the problem with that is a lot of these small particles are actually beneficial that the body needs. So the filtrate contains some wastes, but a whole lot of other substances that we actually need. So step 2 is basically like reversing some of the first process. So it moves the useful solutes back from the filtrate back into the blood again. So all these useful solutes, they get reabsorbed through the wall of the proximal tubule. So we've got our tubule, and remember it's a looped shape, which they call the loop of Henle. So this reabsorption part is happening in the first part of the tubule, which we call the proximal tubule. Basically the part closest to the glomerulus. So the cells in the tubule, they are using all the different transport methods that we've learned about. They're using simple diffusion, facilitated diffusion, and active transport. And they're reabsorbing all those useful chemicals and putting them back into the capillaries which are nearby. You can see how many capillaries there are, and that's why they're wrapped around so tightly around the tubule. Those actual chemicals that are being reabsorbed, so we reabsorb some water, we reabsorb essential ions that we need for our cells, we definitely reabsorb glucose because that's full of lots of energy, and amino acids because they're useful to make more proteins, as well as vitamins and some small proteins. So all those useful chemicals get reabsorbed back in. Finally, the cells on the lining of the tubule, they have lots of microvilli, just like in the digestive system. Lots of little folds here. And that, again, that's going to greatly increase the surface area for reabsorption, just like in the digestive system as well. So you don't need to memorize all the different protein channels that are on this cell, but this is just showing us how these microvilli are increasing the surface area on the inside of the tubule. All right, so step 2, we've reabsorbed the chemicals that we want. Step 3 is tubular secretion. So this is needed because the filtration at the start, it's not perfect. It doesn't actually filter out all of the waste products. So some of the waste that we need to get rid of from the bloodstream are still in the blood at this stage. So tubular secretion is the process where we're getting rid of those excess waste products from the capillaries and sending them back into the tubule to be part of the urine, and that's going to get excreted. So just like with reabsorption, most of this process happens in the proximal tubule. A little bit happens in the other half of the tubule here, which is called the distal tubule, the part further away from the glomerulus. So the waste products, they pass from the capillaries into the tubule, they join with the rest of the filtrate, and they become our urine. So it mostly happens in the proximal, like I said. Some of it happens in the distal tubule. So most importantly, the substances that are still in the blood that we need to secrete into the urine mainly are our nitrogenous wastes, our N wastes, and in particular it's urea. So remember, nitrogenous wastes come from digesting proteins and our cells breaking down proteins. And if there's too much urea or too much nitrogen in our body, it actually becomes toxic at high levels. So urea is one of the most important chemicals that we need to excrete constantly so it doesn't build up to those toxic levels. There are also some ions that get secreted at this stage, and any foreign materials, particularly medications, also get secreted into the tubule at this stage as well. So that's why most medications, they don't do any more benefit if you take too many of them, because your body will just naturally get rid of the excess, as long as you're not taking them at too high levels that they become toxic. All right, so we have basically finished the filtering and making the urine. Step 4 is excretion, which is essentially just getting rid of the urine. So the nephron's finished its job, and the urine flows out of the nephron tubule into the collecting duct, which is the long tube on the side of the nephrons. Then the urine passes out of the kidney into the ureter, depending which kidney it's in, and then down the ureter into the bladder. So we've gone from the kidney, down the ureter, into the bladder. And then whenever we need to go to the toilet, it's going to pass out through the urethra. So unlike the ureters, the urethra actually has skeletal muscle surrounding it, which is really important because that's the muscle that we can control consciously. So when we need to go to the toilet, we can control when we remove the urine when we're ready to do it. Pretty important process that you need to be able to control. A few extra facts at the end. So most urine in a healthy person is about 95% water and only 5% wastes. And throughout a day, there's actually about 180 litres of blood that filters through our kidneys, which is about 5 times as much blood as we have in our entire body. And through that process, it gets about 2 litres of urine in total on an average day. Of course, if you drink lots more water, it's going to get rid of some waste water and will make more urine. And if it's a hot day and we're not releasing much water, well, we're going to have a lot less urine. All right, so here's the learning intentions, and you should be able to do these things at the end.